Hi, and welcome to Jules Voto's Photo Focus. In this video, I'm going to be going over the features, controls, and how to use the Canon FT-QL. The FT-QL is a mechanical 35mm single lens reflex camera which hit the market in March of 1966. A battery is only required for the meter. This camera was in production till 1972, and an improved version, the FTB, had come out in March of 1971. This camera is mostly metal construction with a few plastic parts. It's no lightweight, however. It weighs 1 pound, 10 ounces, or 740 grams without a lens. It's very well made and very reliable. So let's get started on the top right and go over the controls and how they work. Okay, here we have the shutter speed dial. All right, there are speeds from B, let's get it set to B here, up to 1/1000th of a second. You'll also note an X here, that's 1/60th of a second for use with flash. The shutter speed dial only turns in one direction. So if you're at 1/1000th of a second and you want to get to, let's say, 1/4 of a second, you can't go this way. It stops at X. You have to rotate it back to 1/8 of a second. Okay. Also, you will note to set your ASA. Now, back then we called it ASA. Now we call it ISO. It's the exact same thing. 25 ASA is the same as 25 ISO. So there's a little window here, not easy to see. So if you're over 40, you're going to need your glasses. But you basically lift up on this ring and turn it and to set the ISO of the film that you have in the camera. It goes from ISO 25 up to 2000. And also with that flash sync, it's a 1/60th of a second is the top speed. Okay, that's the top flash sync speed. Of course, electronic flash will also sync at any speed below that. To the right of the shutter speed dial is the shutter release, threaded for a cable release. You will note there's a ring around it, okay, that is currently set to A. All right, let's just... All right, you can also set it to L, and the shutter release is locked. Okay, now, however, if you have a cable release mounted, and let's put a cable release on here, and we have it set to lock, okay, the camera will still fire. All right, so with the cable release on, the camera will fire even though it's set for lock. So let's just turn it back to A. Oh, just one other thing. If we have the camera set to B, okay, and we want to have a long exposure, okay, let's cock our shutter here. On B, when you press the shutter release, the shutter will remain open, okay? Well, what we can do is just turn this lever to L, and the shutter will stay open, so you won't have to keep pressure on the shutter release. Time your exposure, then move the lever back. You could also, using the B setting and a locking cable release, keep that shutter open for as long as you need to. Okay, so to the right of the release, of the shutter release, we have our film advance lever. Okay, you can advance film in one single stroke of 174 degrees, or, let's get that off B, or several shorter strokes. Okay, so that lever advances the film, cocks the shutter, and advances the film counter. Okay? All right, so let's go to the front of the camera now. And here we have a multi-function lever. Okay, if we push it in, and I don't know if you could see this through the lens there. It might be a little difficult, but it will stop the lens down. So basically it's a depth of field preview. Okay, it could also be locked in place with this lever at the bottom here. Right now it's opposite the white dot. Okay, if we move this over to L, it keeps the lens stopped down, and then we just press this that way to release it. Okay, now that's an important control on the camera, because this camera uses stop-down metering, and in order to get a meter reading, we must press this lever towards the lens to stop the lens down. Okay, the meter is always on the Canon FT. And so if you're going to store the camera, or you're not using the camera for a while, you're walking around with it over your shoulder, put the lens cap on, because the meter will still be drawing power from the battery. Okay, but when it actually comes time to take a meter reading, you must press that lever in. You can lock it on and leave the lens stopped down. Okay, and the other function of this lever is it is a self-timer. So we just move it in the opposite direction all the way down, press the shutter release, and in approximately 10 seconds, the shutter will fire. Okay, now if we try to set this, let's say halfway, all right, maybe try to get 5 seconds, it just won't work. It'll just, okay, so you must turn this lever all the way down to give you that 10 seconds. Okay, now let's just talk about the lens mount and a little bit about the lenses. Okay, this camera uses what's called a breech lock lens mount. There's a ring, this chrome ring you see here, and that is how you mount and remove the lens. There's no locking button, okay? So we just turn this to the left and the lens comes off. Okay, we place it back on. There's a little red dot on the lens, matches up with the red dot on the camera, and then we turn this lever to the right. Now some people say this breech lock lens mount is superior to a bayonet mount because as the mount wears, this ring could be tightened, you know, a little more. Everybody uses bayonet mount lenses now, so I don't know if that's true. A couple things with these lenses. You will notice an A and an M here. Okay, the A is for automatic aperture. If we set this to M, the lens stops down to the set aperture. Here we have it set for f/16. Hopefully you can see that inside the lens. You're normally always going to have this set on A. If you need to stop the lens down, if you need to observe depth of field, you could just press that lever on the front in. Okay? One thing I really like about these old FL lenses, and the lenses for this camera are designated FL, Canon FL. All right? I like the fact that the aperture ring is right on the front of the lens. It's really easy to get to. I don't know, sometimes if you have gloves on, it's difficult to get to an aperture ring that's close to the body. Now, one other thing as far as the lenses, let's turn this way. As far as the lenses is around 1970, Canon came out with newer cameras and newer lenses that were designated FD. FD lenses are for use on those newer cameras for full aperture metering. You no longer have to stop the lens down to get an accurate reading. Those lenses will work on the FT. However, you can only use them in the stop down mode. They will not work full aperture with the camera. All right, so now on the front left side, okay, we have a mirror lockup. Just bring it up, it locks the mirror up. Mirror lockup, why would you need a mirror lockup? In fact, let's show you how that looks. Let's remove the lens. Okay, and you see the mirror flips up. Two reasons. One, you've got the camera on a tripod, you're using slow shutter speeds. You don't have that flipping mirror that could cause some vibration. The other is for certain lenses. In fact, Canon had a 19 millimeter, I believe, that mounted actually into the mirror box. So if the mirror was down, you wouldn't be able to mount the lens, so you needed to lock the mirror up and then use an accessory viewfinder. Okay, so let's bring that mirror back down. In fact, while we have it open here, it might be a little easier to see. Here we have the connection for flash. We have the PC connection. That is where you would need to plug your flash in because this camera does not have a hot shoe. All right, so let's get this lens back on. Okay. All right, so I spoke about the cold shoe, and this is the cold shoe where you will mount your flash, but it has no connection for a hot shoe flash. You'll notice it says EP here, engraved EP. You will see that on some older cameras from the probably the 50s, 60s, maybe even into the 70s. And these were cameras that were sold in Japan, usually at a military PX. Okay? Now, also on the top left of the camera here, we have the rewind knob and crank. Okay, we also have a battery check. And the way the battery check works is you set the shutter speed to X. Okay, you set the ISO, and I'm not going to change that now, but you set the ISO to 100, and then you press this down to the C mark. Okay, and you hold it in while looking through the viewfinder, and if the needle on the right side of the viewfinder lines up with the circle or goes above it, the battery is good. Okay, one other thing on the side of the camera, on the left side, we have the battery compartment. It takes one PX 625 1.35 volt mercury battery. Those batteries are no longer made. Wine makes, and I believe they're called air cell, that will work. However, they have a very short life. You could also use a 1.5 volt battery. Your metering may be off, but you could just kind of figure out how much it's off and alter your ISO or have the camera modified to accept the higher voltage batteries. Okay, so now let's look at the bottom of the camera. Okay, over here we have the back latch, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. We have a tripod socket and the rewind button. All right, which needs to be pressed into rewind film. I think this is probably a good time to show you how to load the camera. So let's open the back. Okay, we just flip that up, turn it, and the back opens. Now, you will notice the name, in the name of this camera, it's called the FTQL. The QL stands for quick load, and I'm going to show you that in a second, but let me just talk about the shutter. It's a horizontally traveling cloth focal plane shutter. Okay, and again, when loading film and cleaning the camera, you want to try to avoid touching the shutter curtain. Okay, so to load film, what we're going to do, now we've already set our ISO. Okay, let's say we have 400 speed film. We have set it on the shutter speed dial. We then push up on the rewind knob, and I'm going to show you how easy it is to load film in this camera. Canon, I believe, was the only camera that had this type of system. All right, actually, when they went to the F1 camera, the professional camera in 1970, because that camera took motor drives, they couldn't use this quick load system. All right, so we're going to drop the cartridge in, put down the rewind knob, and then bring the film over. You'll notice this red mark here. The leader of the film, it must go that far. Okay, so right there, and then we also make sure that the sprocket holes, this is a bulk roll that I loaded myself, so that's why the leader may not look exactly like what you're used to. So we make sure the sprocket holes engage the sprocket, and then you'll see this piece here drops down and catches the film. We then close the back, and please remember to turn this key. Okay, the back doesn't snap close like a lot of cameras do. You have to turn that back latch key. Okay, now we turn the camera back up. On its bottom. And here's a little tip. This is something I always do. In fact, I've done many of these videos on loading the camera, and I think it's a good idea to just unfold your rewind crank. And I'll show you why in a minute. So now we're going to make a few blanks, right? to get rid of that film that was exposed when we loaded it. So we're going to, all right, oh, it was already cocked. All right, so we're going to turn that. Now notice the rewind crank. Okay, keep an eye on the rewind crank as I make some blanks. You notice how it's turning? There's one blank, and there's another, and now we advance it again and we're ready to take pictures. But as long as that is turning, as you're advancing film, the film is loaded properly. If it's not turning, now you made the first blank and make a second and it's still not turning, then open the camera up, the film has not been loaded properly. Now with this camera it's almost foolproof. As long as you bring that leader up to that red mark, it will load properly. Okay, so all right, how do you take pictures with the camera? All right, this camera has what's called a partial or semi-spot metering system. The center of the focusing screen has a rectangular area that's a little darker than the rest of the screen. That is where the CDS cell is measuring the light. Okay, it takes up about 12% of the picture area. To meter accurately, you're going to press this lever right to the left to the lens mount, and then turning your shutter speed dial or your aperture ring, you're going to center the needle on the right side of the viewfinder into that circle. Okay, if it's centered, you have an accurate reading. Now, because this is a partial meter, because it's a semi-spot meter, you want to be really accurate in what you're metering. If you're taking a photo of a person, let's say at the beach, and they're standing near the water, and you have all this water and sky in the background, you want to make sure you're metering the person and not picking up too much of that sky. So you could move in closer and make sure you get a reading off the person, set your exposure, and then step back. Because if that meter is seeing a lot of that sky, you are going to be underexposed on the person. You'll almost have a silhouette type shot. Okay, so you press that in, adjusting your aperture or shutter speed, and get correct exposure. Now, you can set the aperture ring anywhere in between stops. Now, these are just full stops. Some camera manufacturers have half stops. I think Canon went to that when they went to FD. But these are full stops. So, but you can set it anywhere in between to center that needle properly. Your shutter speeds, however, must be set to the full speed. So either a 500th or a 250th, 125th of a second, whatever. You don't want to set it in between. Okay? Let's see, what else? All right, so now we took our pictures. We got some great shots. And now we're going to take the film out. Okay, so we reached the end of the roll. We're going to press in this button here. This is the rewind button. Okay, once you press it in, it will stay in until you move the advance lever. We then unfold the rewind crank. All right, and I want you to look at this. And again, this is small. It might be a little difficult to see. There is a red dot on the rewind button. As we rewind film, it turns. When it stops turning, the film is back into the cassette. And okay, it's still turning. All right, now it's stopped. Now I want to leave this leader out, so I'm not going to turn it anymore. All right, so I open the back of the camera. All right, and you can still see some leader. Now, if I had turned that another half a turn or so, the leader would have went into the cassette, which I don't want to happen because this is just a test roll that I use. Okay. Let's close that up. Again, make sure you turn the key, lock it down so that back doesn't open. Oh, one other thing I should have mentioned when I was talking about metering, as far as the viewfinder gives you about 94% view. Okay, so you're going to get a little bit more on the film than what you see in the viewfinder. There is a microprism spot, center spot, right in the middle of that darkened area. That is the metering area, and that is your focusing aid. It makes it pretty easy to focus. This camera has a, snaps in and out of focus very well. As far as the meter, it will meter down to EV3, which would mean an exposure of 1/4 of a second at 1.4 with a 100 speed film. Now, Canon had sort of a unique accessory for this camera that I don't know. I know Nikon, Canon, I know Nikon, Minolta, Pentax did not have such an accessory, but it was a booster. It was a meter booster, okay? And what you would do is you would remove the battery, and it plugged in. It had its own battery. It plugged in here and then went into the accessory shoe, and that enabled you to meter down to minus 3.5 EV. So the normal meter, the built-in meter in the camera, can meter down to 3 EV. This went down to minus 3.5 EV, so it took you down to really low light. I'm sure you could probably find them. Whether they work or not, I wouldn't know. So these cameras are readily available. There's a ton of them on eBay. A lot of the meters don't work. As I said earlier, this camera was updated in 1971, and that camera was called the FTB-QL. And there were some nice improvements. And finally, in 1973, there was the FTBN, which had some minor improvements over the FTB. This camera was still in production till early 1972. All right, now in the future, I'll be doing a video on the Canon FTBN of 1973. So look for that probably in a few months or so. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel and hit that bell so you'll be alerted anytime I come out with a new video. And I usually come out with a new video every Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. So I will talk to you then.